This is an overview of the structure of my presentation today. I'm going to start with a quick introduction, so let you know who I am, where I teach and what stage I teach. I'm then going to talk about who Jane Considine is and what her approaches are. So we're looking at the right stuff and hooked on books. Thirdly, I'll move on to looking at writing in a little bit more depth. I'll explain how I've managed to implement this in my classroom. I can show you some pupil work, and I'll also talk through my practitioner inquiry that I undertook into the right stuff approach. And finally, I will talk about reading. I'm going to focus on something called book talk. I can share some videos of my class undertaking book talk, and I will also talk about the impact that this has had on reading in my class and the wider school. Hello, my name is Hope Wilson and I am a primary school teacher in Midlothian. I currently teach primary 7 and I have done for the past 3 years. My interests include languages, so my degree was primary education with German. As part of this, I had the amazing experience of being able to teach abroad, which led to me questioning some of our curriculum and how we could implement things that other countries do. I'm also passionate about literacy and how to engage learners with literacy. I have undertaken quite a lot of training in reading and writing and trialled quite a lot of things in my classroom to see what pupils respond best to and what has the biggest impact. And the two things that I'm going to speak to you about today are things that I feel have made a big difference to my pupils' learning. The reading and writing approaches that I'm going to be discussing today were written by Jane Considine. Jane Considine is a teacher, an author and an education consultant based in England, but the principles of these approaches can be linked really easily to the Scottish curriculum. In lockdown, Jane Considine ran a series of very engaging sessions on writing, and after going through this training online, I started to question the way that I was conducting writing lessons in class, and I was really eager to try this out on the return from lockdown. Jane Considine then ran a further block of sessions on reading this time, and again I started to question my reading approach in class and was really eager to try it out in class. So I went back into the classroom, I tried them out and had really successful results, and it's now something that we're able to take forward in our whole school because of the results we've had. The approaches are called the right stuff, that is the writing approach obviously, and you have the reading approach called hooked on books, but it's probably best known for something called book talk, and it is book talk that I'm going to focus on today. These approaches for reading and writing are really based around the idea that reading and writing need to be explicitly taught and modelled. Teachers' role is to scaffold the writing and reading process through guided demonstrations and rich talking opportunities to gather vocabulary and ideas. The right stuff approach can be used to teach both non-fiction and fiction writing. In a typical unit, there are 3 parts to the writing process. Firstly, you have the guided writing sessions, and this is really to explore the structure of a specific genre. I will go into more depth about this in a second. You then have your independent write. This is where pupils are using the techniques learned in the guided writing sessions and really applying these to an independent piece which you can then assess. And you then also have editing time, so pupils are given time to respond to feedback and make alterations to enhance their writing. This is what a typical plan for the guided writing session will look like. This is based on Jane Considine's unit, A Monster Calls. This is actually a free unit which can be downloaded on her website, and I've posted the link below if you would like to give it a go. This is a year 6, so a primary 7 level piece of writing. So in a guided writing session, pupils are guided through a series of lessons by the teacher. Writing usually takes place every day for roughly an hour. I've now usually got them doing it within about 45 to 50 minutes, and we do it about 4 times a week. During these lessons, teachers' role is to introduce and reinforce a range of writing techniques and enable pupils to use them correctly in their own writing. The timescale for the guided sessions is dependent on what size of text you are covering and size of text you want them to create in the end. Some units are only maybe about 5 lessons long, other ones can take a couple of weeks. But like I said, this is dependent on the size of text you actually want them to create. In a guided writing session, the children are to write 3 chunks of writing each lesson. So you can see here on the plan down in the corner, you have learning chunk 1, you have learning chunk 2, and you have learning chunk 3. Within each of these chunks, there are 3 sections. You have initiate, you have model, and you have enable. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what these actually are and what they might look like. So the initiate phase, this is the first bit that they will do, and this is really where the teacher's role is the main priority really. The teacher will initiate pupil interest and engagement. The main purpose is to inspire and captivate their attention. This could be through drama, it might be physical artifacts, it could be music, it might be short video clips that you found, pictures, whatever you think is there to inspire them to sort of gather vocabulary and enhance the writing process. In the initiate phase, the pupils are to gather language, and this will then be used in their enable phase. This really is a guided section of it. So the teacher is talking through it, pupils are talking together, you can then feed back to the class, the teacher can write this up on the board, and pupils write their own ideas into their jotters too. This is a rich talking experience, and from my teaching that I've done, I found this to be really beneficial in actually building the confidence of the learners and getting them to try out things that they've maybe not used before, or to talk about vocabulary that they've not come across before. So this is a really exciting bit for the learners, and they really enjoy the initiate phase of writing. Your next section is model, and this is where, as a teacher, you model a sentence. This could be talking out loud about your actual thought process, and this really lets the learners see how a sentence is constructed, and it sort of gives the opportunity for you to deliberately make mistakes that they can pick up on or you can pick up on, and in a way it's modelling that process. Actually, we don't get it perfect first time, we need to go back, we need to check our sentences. Sometimes we've misspelled a word, sometimes we've missed out a word and it doesn't quite make sense. So it's a way to sort of make deliberate mistakes and make teaching points out of this. Obviously, you don't need to do this every time. It could be that you're just modelling a sentence ready for them to go straight into theirs. That's sort of what you feel is best needed for your pupils. And the final phase is enable. Enable is the pupils' time to write. So they should be using the vocabulary that they gathered during the initiate phase, and they should be creating a sentence with the skill that you've chosen. So on this plan, these 2 symbols are complex sentence and punctuation. So obviously the main goal is for them to use a list-like phrase. So you would be looking for them to use all the vocabulary gathered, using the knowledge they gained from your modelled sentence to then go off and complete their own. Some of your lower ability pupils, or pupils that maybe struggle with writing, might have a very similar sentence to you with just a few of the descriptive words changed, and that is fine. Whereas some of your other learners who are quite able in writing or enjoy the writing process might go off and completely change the sentence, and that is fine. As long as they're getting that success criteria in there, which in this case would be the list-like phrase, then whatever they write is their own choice. As time goes on, you will notice that children who struggled with writing will start to go away from your modelled sentence and be more creative with their own, but it does take some time for them to build that confidence up. This is an example of a writing layout page. What I do is I have them get a double page in their writing jotters. One side of the book is called the vocabulary vault. That's just what we've named it. Online you'll find a lot of teachers that use the Write Stuff approach, and they might have slightly different names for this section. We voted on using vocabulary vault, and this is where we gather all our ideas. So you can see chunk 1, and our focus was obviously on personification, and this pupil has gathered words about what they could use in terms of personification. So groaned, screamed, moaned, etc. You'll then say they go down here and they're on to chunk 2, gathering vocabulary, and they're doing a metaphor. And then down the bottom, chunk 3 was adverbs. So really one side of the page is where they can gather all their ideas so that they've got them there for when they're actually writing their sentences. On the other side of the page, this is your writing page. So once you have gathered all the vocabulary for chunk 1 and the pupils are on to the enable phase for chunk 1, they would write their writing onto this page. So this pupil has said, as she punched against the heavy door, it screamed out in horror. So she's written her sentence of personification there, and then she would be ready to go on to chunk 2 with the class. I also use just a little tick sheet for the success criteria for them to see whether they've added it in, and it just helps me at the end of the day look at writing quickly, see if there's something that the pupils haven't understood on a whole, and that's something I can build into further lessons too. Like I said, it's really up to you how you lay out the writing, and online there's lots of different ideas of how you do it. But I found this to work best because it keeps their ideas separate to their writing, but it's still clear to see that connection between them. I'm now going to look at the impact that the Right Stuff approach has had on writing in my class. I carried out a practitioner inquiry into the Right Stuff approach, and this was in the year 2020-2021. After conducting initial assessments on the return to school in the August, and this included a cold piece of writing, it became really apparent that literacy, and in particular writing, was an area of development for my previous primary 7 class. Analysing the pieces of the cold writing, it was quite obvious that the children couldn't really use a range of techniques. Punctuation was also quite an issue, and the standard of writing was really low. So I used the Curriculum for Excellence benchmarks to look at what second level learners should be achieving, and in my table I had this along the top, and I went through their piece of writing and sort of analysed it. If they used it and used it well, they got a green. If they were sort of using it but it wasn't to the standard that they should be, they got an amber, and if there really wasn't any evidence at all, then it was a red. It was really clear that punctuation was not being used accurately, and they weren't using the techniques for their age and stage, which would be expected, and things that really they should have been aware of and they should have been using. So from this, I decided to trial the Right Stuff approach. As the primary 7s were finding including appropriate punctuation and techniques challenging, I felt as though this sort of intensive modelled approach was the best way to go and would hopefully be really effective in actually teaching them the skills, but also improving their confidence with using them. This here is, like I said, the example data analysis from August 2020. So this was the first analysis I did of their writing. You can probably see as well that some children obviously had a few greens, but on a whole, it really was ambers and reds across the board. This data analysis was in December 2020, 4 months after implementing the Right Stuff approach. From analysing this piece of cold writing, it became apparent that this approach to writing had increased the attainment level for the class as a whole. Most noticeably, learners were able to include independently figurative language and other writing techniques that previously they were unable to. The standard of writing had also increased, with pupils able to write more coherently and longer pieces of writing. The increase in attainment was also seen in our whole school cold piece writing. As a school, we have our own assessment for writing using a criteria scale, and when learners undertook their cold piece for this, most had increased their level, with some actually jumping up to full levels on the criteria scale. The confidence of learners with their writing had also increased, so I had children who previously really said they hated writing, now enjoying writing, choosing to write in their free time, and confident to share their writing with their peers and with me. They were more eager to sort of include new techniques, and challenge themselves to use vocabulary that they've never really come across before or they've never heard of. So they're always looking for ways to improve their writing without really being prompted by myself. As you can see from looking at the table, there were still some areas that needed developed across the board, but this was only 4 months into using the approach. But on a whole, you can see that actually a lot of the children had gained more greens on the table than they had previously. So in those 4 months, we had seen a lot of success, and 4 months is quite a short period of time. So we're really pleased with the results, and it was something that we felt would be really beneficial to carry on in class. This piece of writing that you can see here was one of the initial cold pieces of writing I conducted in the August when returning to school. This was based on a little short film clip about 2 trees, and this is what the learner managed to produce after an hour of writing. As you can see from this really isn't the standard you would expect from primary 7, and this was actually a child who was quite an able writer and had some really good ideas, but struggled to get them down on the paper. I'll give you a little bit of time to read this so that you can see really the standard for yourself. You will notice that they don't really have much description in it. There's no sort of obvious techniques really, a couple of adverbial phrases at the start, but that was sort of about it. This piece of writing that you can now see was the same child's writing that was in the previous slide, except this was now done in December. Straight away you can see there was more content to begin with. When you start reading, you'll be able to see there's a lot more description. We have repetitive phrases, we had adverbial phrases, we had sort of precise language choices in terms of colour, and I was really impressed with this development from the previous piece of writing in August. There are still some things in here that the learner needed to work on, so there's a mix-up of tenses at some point, and this is something we then focused on going forward in the class. But I will give you some time to sort of read this so that you can see the difference in the standard after just 4 months. The writing you can now see on your screen is from a pupil that I have in my class this year. This pupil really finds writing challenging. At the start of the year, they needed one-to-one support, really heavily supported by an adult, in which the adult would need to write on the whiteboard and they would then need to copy down into their jotter. They really needed the peer support of being able to gather vocabulary, come up with ideas. The top picture you can see that starts with the moon's surface sparkled. That was a really heavily supported piece of writing. So this was one-to-one adult support, and this was conducted in August 2021. There is still some nice language in here, obviously, but this was part of a guided write, so they were able to pick up language from their peers and choose words. Down the bottom, you can now see the same child's piece of writing, and this was in November 2021. This was during a guided writing session, but there was no one-to-one support with a teacher. So this pupil was able to use the guided writing sessions to go off and write this by herself. And a lot of these ideas were not actually ideas that anyone else had suggested. These were her own ideas. She'd chosen her own vocabulary and had just followed the structure. So I was really impressed by the impact that this writing approach has had on this pupil. And she also is really impressed and proud of her progress. So you'll be able to see the massive difference this has had in terms of the confidence, but also the language being used. The writing works for pupils who obviously need help in terms of structuring writing and improving their writing overall. But the writing approach is also really good for your learners who are confident writers, who you feel have the basics of writing and the knowledge of the techniques. Children can go off and be creative on their own. There's something called deepening the moment, which sort of challenges the learners to add extra information that we've not discussed as a class and to really make their writing their own. So it's not just an approach for children who find writing challenging, it's an approach that can help all children no matter their original ability. And if it is something that you feel like you would like to look into further, there's lots of resources on Jane Considine's website, there's books, and there's also online training. but I would suggest it's something that works really well in a class. And if you do feel like you want to change your writing structure, this is a great approach to do. I'm going to move on to reading next, but if there are any questions about writing, please get in touch with me and I can point you in the right direction on more resources. The Hooked on Books approach to reading has 3 different types of reading. You have guided comprehension, you have independent comprehension, and you have book talk. I'm going to focus on book talk today, but if you do want to know more about guided comprehension or independent comprehension, I'm happy for you to ask any questions. But I would also suggest you have a look at Jane Considine's website. She has online training. She also has her own book that goes through the approach. But the guided and independent comprehensions are quite self-explanatory anyway. It's sort of you going through the skills in a guided way and then allowing them later in the week to try it independently. There's probably stuff that you're doing in class anyway, and there's not one sort of set structured way to do this. But like I said, I'm happy to answer any questions later, but I'm going to talk specifically about book talk. This is my adapted format of book talk. I don't follow the exact format that has been suggested by Jane Considine. She suggests that book talk takes place every day for 30 minutes, but I've found that this doesn't quite work in my class at the moment, just with other things that are timetabled in and other things that go on in the school. What I've found works for me is 2 45-minute, 50-minute lessons a week focused on book talk, and I ensure that's timetabled in every single week. Book talk's something that probably is quite adaptable and you can fit it in the best way you feel suits the needs of your class. Like I said, she suggests every day, but I've not quite managed to make that suit in my class. I'm going to talk through my adapted format. If you're someone who knows a little bit about this already, or you're someone new to it, please bear in mind, obviously this is my adapted format. I'm talking through what works best for me, but this might not necessarily be the way that works best for your class. So my adapted approach, like I said, I do it twice a week. I focus on one lens and I will show you the lenses in the minute. Jane Considine suggests you do 3 lenses within the 30 minutes that she does. I found, especially in the upper years, that by the time we read our books and I give them sufficient time to read and then I display a lens, I've really only got time to do one. My class are quite into doing really in-depth answers. Other classes in my school manage to get through 2 in one lesson because their answers aren't as long or in-depth. Like I said, it's what really works for you in terms of your timetable and your class needs. I have tried this out in a number of ways. The main way that I do it is our levelled group novels. So my class are in groups. I've got 4 different groups and they all have their own group novel depending on their reading ability. I've also tried it with our class novel and the one that I read to the class. I've tried mixed ability pairings and groups, and recently I've tried sort of high quality picture books as well as a way to make it more accessible for some of the learners in the class. I also make all my groups share their answer to the class. I know some teachers who don't make their groups share, some teachers feel like they've not got enough time, but I find this is a great way to enhance your listening and talking within the class and improve their confidence across the curriculum in terms of speaking out loud, sharing their opinion and their ideas. I'm going to go through the sort of book talk rainbow in a second, and hopefully this becomes a bit more clearer. I'm going to talk a bit about the organisation of a book talk session, but before I do that, I'm just going to briefly explain what book talk actually is. The clue's in the name, it's about talking about books. Really it's about learners reading together, being able to then discuss the text, making links, bringing in evidence to their answers, and I'll focus on the ways you can do this with the reading rainbow in a second. But it really is all about that verbal comprehension that children need to then be able to progress into doing written comprehension. So the way I organise my book talk sessions is that I make sure that the groups are given time to read. Older classes are obviously able to read independently, and I maybe go round on a rotation and support groups and write my observation notes. Usually when I'm observing groups read in the older years, I'm looking at their fluency, I'm looking at whether they're able to track and trace from the person in front, I'm looking at their expression, how confident are they reading, are they clear? And I usually just keep a track of these notes to see if there's any pupils that maybe need a bit of extra support one-to-one with an adult at some point throughout the week. It really is dependent on how you run your reading sessions. Obviously, if you have support from a learning assistant, it might be that they work with a specific group once and you work with another. You might have it on a sort of rotation. If you're in the younger years, the structure might have to be a bit different. If your children can't read independently, which a lot of the younger years they can't, you might have to read with a group and set the other group off on another task and read with the other group after. It really is flexible for what your class needs. In the older years, like I said, they're more independent, so book talk can flow easier. You can sort of set them off to read and support where you find necessary. In the younger years, it might need to be more structured in terms of you trying to figure out when you read with each group so that they can then go off and discuss their books as a group. This is the Reading Rainbow, and this is what you would use to structure your book talk lessons. There are 3 layers to the Reading Rainbow, and I'm going to talk through what these layers really are. But in a book talk session, you would be picking what you call a lens. So for example, you have feeling, that's a lens, and that would be your focus for your discussion. So you are focusing in on the feelings within the book. In the interactive rainbow, which you can purchase from Jane Considine's website, there's lots of different sentence stems within each of these lenses. So lots of different ways for children to start their sentences and discuss the lenses in different ways. That is a really good tool. You don't need to buy it. It's just something that's there to aid book talk and give you some ideas for how to structure it. The 3 layers are called the fantastics, the stylistic, and the analytics. So the fantastics, these are really the ideas of reading, the ideas that authors use in their writing. So this links really heavily into writing. It really hones in on specific techniques that are weaved into the pieces of texts. So really weaved throughout and are apparent in all pieces of writing. You then have the stylistics. This is being able to extract meaning through discussing things like setting, commenting on text structure, being able to identify themes and intended impact. And your final section are called analytics. And this is really about being able to analyse text. This can be the most challenging layer for children, but it's something that they really need to work on to be able to get that analysis going and enhance their answers for their written comprehension. This is really being able to explain your thinking, being able to then relate this back to the text. Why are you thinking this? It's about evaluating and interpreting. So these are the skills that children really do find the most difficult, but through book talk, they can work on this in a more relaxed way, and you should hopefully find that when they come to their written comprehension, they're more confident with these sorts of skills of the evaluating, the inferring, the deducing, and it does make a really big difference to have them verbalise them first and then go into the written aspect of it. I'm now going to talk through the structure of a book talk lesson. Please note that this is different to the one suggested by Jane Considine. Again, this is my adapted version that I've found to work best for my class, and the way you run it might be slightly different as well. It's all about finding the balance for your class and what suits their needs. So what I do is I have pupils sit with their groups and read their group novels. Usually this lasts for about 25 minutes. It's obviously dependent on how much time I've got timetabled in for my reading session for book talk. If it's around 50 minutes, it's usually 25 minutes of reading in their groups. I observe and support at least one group. I'm sometimes able to do 2. It just sort of depends on who I feel needs support. If I'm observing a group and they're maybe finding the actual reading challenging, then I usually stay with them for that whole reading session. But if I'm with a group who are really sort of independent with their reading, fluent, I've got no concerns, then I can usually move on quite quickly after a quick observation, writing my notes about them. After sort of that 25 minutes of reading, I stop all groups and we gather together and I display our class sentence stem. So I would go back to that reading rainbow, I would pick one of the lenses. For example, if I did setting, I would pick setting, and I would pick a sentence stem to display on the board about setting. The children then have to use this sentence stem to structure the answer. They should all start with this one sentence stem to then go on and talk about their own book. I usually give them about 5 minutes to discuss their text and to construct their answer. At times, pupils ask for extra time. That is fine. If you feel that you want to give them extra time, then you can do this. Again, it's obviously dependent on how much time you've got timetabled in for this lesson. Usually I would say 5 minutes, and if you are short on time, then you can be quite strict on that 5 minutes and say that's all they've got and they must have an answer. Some of my groups write their answers down on a whiteboard, others prefer just to remember their answer. It's really up to them how they do it. I've found that if you say to them they can't write anything down, they might get a bit stressed and forget what they want to say, whereas if they're allowed a few notes, it usually helps them have that more coherent answer in the end. I ask all groups to then feed back to the class. Like I said previously, this is my choice to do this, but I find that it really does push them sometimes out of their comfort zone, and in the end it enhances their listening and talking. And I found that pupils who at the start really were nervous to speak in front of the whole class are now some of the first ones up to come up and speak. So it's not forcing them to say stuff they don't want. It could be that they're just up there with their group as sort of moral support for their group, or it could be that you ask them maybe just to say the sentence starter, or maybe they've chosen in their group just to hold up the pictures, but it's getting them involved in some way with the answer. Everyone needs to be involved in this final answer. I award points to the teams. So some teachers don't like doing this, some classes don't like it. My class, in the 2 years that I've done this, have responded really well to that competitive point system. So I would give them a point for using their sentence stem. We usually have a bonus word which they have to try and include. If they manage to do it correctly, they would get a point. I would give them points for them being able to include direct quotes that relate to their answer, and it has to relate, and they must be able to explain how it relates. I would give them points for any pictures or illustrations they managed to talk about, and again, it has to link to that original answer. Any links that they find, whether that's within the book itself, whether it's to other books, whether it's to real life, again, they can get points for that. But you have to be really clear that the answer has to link. We can't just bring in a random quote because we want a point. If it doesn't fit the answer, it doesn't get a point. I usually give the feedback, but once the children are really confident with giving their answers and listening to the feedback, you can get them involved in the feedback process. So my class now, I usually ask someone to tell the group something they liked, and I ask someone else to tell them something that they think they could improve on or work on for next time. And they've responded really well to this. And in fact, because you've got that competitive edge, they usually do give quite specific feedback, which really does then enhance the group's answer for next time. But like I said, this is my adapted version. It doesn't necessarily work for every class. There's other teachers in my school that maybe don't give out the points, or they do the initial reading slightly different. It's just about giving children the opportunity to read, discuss their text, and then share their answer with people. It really is that talking process that we want to implement in the classroom.
Relationships in the story are Charles and his mother. We know this because his mum is extremely controlling, which leads to a complicated relationship. He thinks that everything he does is wrong and sees his mother's hat everywhere, as clowns, fence posts and statues. This shows that he is quite scared and intimidated by her. For example, it doesn't say she asked.
Negative relationships in the story are Smudge's dad and Charles's mum, also known as Charlie. They both think badly about each other.
I saw him talking to a very rough-looking child, says Charles' mum. We can tell that Charles' mum doesn't really care what she says, and she's really careless. She says rough.
And also in these pictures, talking about the relationship with Charles and his mum, it looks like the mum's, everything in this picture is to do with the mum. So that could be a shadow standing over him, the mum's watching his every move. And in this other photo, it shows the difference between how they're thinking. So Smudge is thinking all happy things, it's a castle and there's flowers, where Smudge looks a bit more sad and it's cloudy and it's dark, and the two people on the bike look like they're struggling to get away from each other and they can't get away. So I think that's maybe relating to between the relationship of him and his mum.
The relationship between Charles and his mum is very complicating because Charles' mum is very strict, and we think his mum just wants Charlie to do well in life, and she's just really strict for that reason.
And we also don't think it's very good because, if your parents think this way, then normally you kind of take after your parents, so it's new generations coming down and they might just take after their parents, and it's just not good.
We predict that Callum and Sophie will fall in love because on the front cover they are embracing, which also links to Romeo and Juliet because they...
It's forbidden love because they are not allowed to be together because their families have a feud, but they still want to be together, so they die for each other because of love.
Exactly.
We can make a reasoned assumption that Adonis had a whole family because the text states he's been very quiet since the others were taken away, from page 72. Using this quote, we can infer that Adonis's family was taken away because it was too difficult to feed them during World War II. We also know that Adonis is very lonely. We know this because the text also states, so you're telling me that Beast is grieving, also on page 72. In conclusion, this assumption changes our initial thoughts on the entire book. It proves that Mrs. F isn't as cruel as we initially assumed, and that Joseph is less alone than he knows. And Amy's going to
a link to the story is Joseph from the book, as Joseph's family was also taken away from him as he's an evacuee. His dad is off fighting, his mum is dead, and his granny was unable to care for him. Therefore, Adonis and Joseph are similar.
We can make a reasoned assumption that Sophie recognises Paris because she has been there with her mum before she abandoned her. Proof is on page 90, and it says, but I was actually thinking the chimney pots, they look familiar.
A prediction is the reason she's on the roofs in the front cover is so that she can see the chimneys on the roof because she remembers them from her younger life.
Our initial reaction, we were quite surprised because at the start of the book it says about her going onto a boat, and I think maybe before she went onto the boat she was looking up to the sky and she might have saw all the chimneys, so that's where she's getting the memory from.
And we don't think it links to real life at all because you wouldn't normally see people jumping across rooftops in Paris. And we think there's a lot of different emotions going on in the book just now because, Sophie's trying to find her mum, Charles is trying to keep Sophie happy and trying to get her to find her mum, and there's just a lot of emotions.
We found that Book Talk has had a really positive impact on our reading in school. Pupils are now more engaged with their texts and are motivated to read these. They are engaged with reading lessons and actively participate in group discussions. It's not just within reading we've noticed this active participation, but across the curriculum when they're asked to discuss things with peers or in a group, they're more engaged in these discussions and are on task. We found that their confidence has increased and they're more confident sharing their opinions. And again, it's not just within reading, it's across the school, community, within different situations that they're more confident. We are finding that pupils use more sophisticated vocabulary, and this is both when talking and writing. So book talks are a really good way of enhancing vocabulary used by your class, and we noticed that they are becoming more sophisticated in the words they're using and the way they're structuring their sentences. And we have seen a positive impact on the written comprehension answers. So obviously we've seen research before that children need to be able to verbalise before they can write, and this plays into reading as well. They need to be able to verbalise that comprehension before they can then go and do written comprehension answers. So overall, it's had a really, really positive impact on reading in my class, and now as we adopt it as a whole school, it's having a positive impact on learners throughout school. My presentation has just been a really quick introduction to Jane Considine's reading and writing approaches, and like I said, mine is an adapted version of her approaches. Jane Considine has lots of free material available on her website, which you should go and have a look at if you are interested. I would suggest that this is a really good way to enhance reading and writing in your class or across your school. It's really easy to sort of start and pick up, and hopefully you would find that it has positive impact like it has for my class and my wider school community. I'm available to take any questions you may have, because I know I might have flew through some of the stuff and it might have been a bit confusing at times. So please feel free to ask any questions and I can try and clear anything up or give you some more information.